Hi, I'm Joshua Knobe.
Hi, I'm Jesse Bering.
Hey, and today we're going to be talking about the cognitive science of religion.
Yes,
So we're going to be asking questions about how people normally think about religion and about what the sort of fundamental cognitive processes are that underlie our religious beliefs.
that's
So to
right.
begin with, I just wanted to talk about sort of the basic idea behind cognitive science of religion. So why is it that we use all these kinds of tricky techniques to get at the cognitive science of religion instead of simply asking people outright what their religious beliefs are and what kind of doctrines they subscribe to?
Well, I think one of the fundamental differences between our discipline, which is the cognitive science of religion, and say the psychology of religion, is that we're much more interested in the basic cognitive architecture underlying religious belief and religious intuitions, for that matter. We're not terribly interested in individual differences and what people say they believe. Because, in fact, I think that we could capture a lot of people's intuitive beliefs or the way that they sort of reason about these big existential questions through experimental laboratory methods rather than simply asking them what they believe.
So someone might say, though, that the sort of even the fundamental sort of cognitive architecture underlying, say, Christianity might be really different from that underlying, say, Buddhism, that these are really different. But are you thinking there's a single answer that's going to explain the cognitive science of all religions, of Buddhism, of Christianity, etc.?
I wouldn't say there's a single answer per se. I think that we can look at religion and we can sort of carve it up into its constituent joints. I think that there are fundamental attributes in all religious systems that are shared. That, of course, there's tremendous cross-cultural variation and differences in terms of how individuals believe. But if you look across the board at all religious belief systems, you find commonalities. For example, you see a belief that the psychology of the individual or the self survives biological death. You see some sort of creationist beliefs. You see some sort of belief that there is a meaning behind natural events and that they're communicating messages to the self somehow. These basic core sort of existential questions that aren't necessarily theological in nature, but nevertheless play a significant role in religion.
So are you thinking if we just asked people what their religious beliefs were, that somehow what they told us wouldn't reflect, in a sense, their real religious beliefs or how they really thought about religion?
I wouldn't trust what people say to my face as necessarily being indicative of how they actually think. I think that survey reports and questionnaires, for example, don't necessarily capture people's private psychology. That's not to say that people don't believe what they say they believe, but they might not simply be aware of what they're thinking at a very sort of subconscious level.
Well, here it's maybe helpful to think about this research, like, for example, by Barrett and Kyle, showing that people's way of thinking about religion is really different from the way that they say that they think about religion.
That's right. So you're talking about the theologically correct and incorrect. So, yeah, that's actually been quite a while since I've read that literature, but that goes back to 1989. And those findings basically suggested that although people would say, for example, that God can do everything simultaneously, this sort of this omniscience or this omnipotent power, in fact, they reasoned that he can only solve one problem at a time. So if two children are drowning simultaneously at different ends of the earth in two different rivers, they basically say that God saves one child first and listens to his prayers first, and then saves the other child. When in fact, if they really believed that God was omnipowerful, then they would actually say that he did it simultaneously.
Oh, so cognitive science of religion maybe could reveal aspects of the way people think about God that they even themselves don't know. If we just asked them, they'd say, I think of God as omnipotent. But we could find out that they really think of God as only being able to do one thing at a time or something.
That's right. This sort of there are limitations on God's abilities in terms of his cognitive processing demands, just as there are limitations with everyday mundane human beings.
So let's talk about
sort of how the folk concept of God would actually go.
So let's talk about some of the different aspects of religious belief. So the one that you started out by mentioning was belief in the afterlife. So the key question now is, why do people believe that they will, in some sense, go on existing even after they die?
Right, so that's been a bit of the focus of my research, which is investigating the nature of believing in the afterlife, or how people are predisposed psychologically to envisioning the continuity of the mind surviving death. There are two basic counterpoints. One is that children essentially learn to believe in the afterlife as a consequence of being indoctrinated by their parents or by the church or being exposed through cultural influences. But the other position would be that children intuitively or naturally, essentially, reason that the mind survives the body. In other words, they don't have to really learn that there's an afterlife in as much as they reason and rationalize that the mind survives the body or biological death in itself. It's a bit of a tricky question, actually, because if you think about putting children into a laboratory and asking them questions about death, a lot of parents feel a little bit uncomfortable having an experimenter teach their children these types of beliefs about the afterlife, materialist beliefs for that matter, or something along those lines. So we have to sort of tread carefully in terms of how we investigate this. But children obviously are the best source of probing the natural or default bases of how people reason about the afterlife, because the younger they are, the less adulterated their minds are in the sense of being polluted by cultural residue. So I have done some research on children's reasoning about the afterlife and the age differences, essentially. Should I tell you a little bit about that study, or...?
Yes, I'd love to.
Okay, I've actually got a little bit of a visual display here to kind of help tell you about the study that we did. This was a study that was done shortly after 9/11, and parents, of course, again, were very careful and reticent about having their children ask questions about death and what happens to the individual after death. So we tried to make this as innocuous as possible. To do that, we had a puppet show, basically. I'll show you a little picture here. That was me as a graduate student, presumably anyway, putting on a puppet show for children between the ages of about 3 to 12 years of age. And basically these children saw a puppet show where there was a mouse. You can see the mouse right here. And we said that the mouse was hungry and it was thirsty. It was lost in the forest. It was thinking about its mother. It was angry at its brother. It was just sort of wandering around this forest environment. And it was ruminating about all sorts of psychological states. And just, one small example, it ate some grass right before this incident occurred. All of a sudden, this alligator popped out from behind the bushes and ate the mouse. And now the mouse is dead. Now that the mouse is dead, we asked the children, can he still taste the flavor of the grass that he ate? Is he still hungry? Is he still thirsty? Is he still angry at its brother? Is he still thinking about its mother? Does he still want to go home? And so on. Now, what we found with this particular study was that the younger the child, the more likely they were to say that psychological states survived biological death. With increasing age, presumably, and the more scientific information the children had, the more likely they were to say that these psychological states stopped at biological death. So the younger the child, the more of sort of an afterlife belief system they actually had, which was counterintuitive to, I think, the common sense view that children learn about the afterlife because they're afraid of death or parents teach them about death. And these were 3-year-olds, essentially, that were saying that the mind survived death.
So there's a common view that, in some sense, belief in the afterlife is a part of our culture, and it's handed down by our culture just like many other beliefs that are handed down by our culture. But would you say it's actually the opposite? That it's only belief that there isn't an afterlife that is handed down by our culture? That is to say, certain parents might believe that there's not an afterlife, and they have to pass down to their children the belief that there's not an afterlife. But if you don't do anything to prevent someone from believing in an afterlife, then they just automatically will believe in an afterlife.
Right, so in that sense, being a materialist or reasoning that the mind stops after death would sort of be the effortful stance. It would be going against the grain of human psychology. I've got a particular theoretical framework that I think addresses that, but it's open to empirical investigation, I think, still, which is that we have difficulty conceptualizing the absence of consciousness. We can't really easily imagine what it feels like not to think, not to have emotions, and so on. That takes a particular scientific knowledge or a theoretical understanding between the relationship between the body and the mind that children at that age simply don't have. So when they're trying to think about what it's like to be dead, they put themselves essentially into the shoes of the dead character.
So the thought is, if I said something like, Jesse, imagine you have a very sharp pain in your knee. then you could imagine that. But if I said, Jesse, imagine that you don't feel or think anything at all. Just try to imagine being in a state where you have no thoughts and no feelings. You wouldn't even know what to imagine. It would be impossible to imagine that.
Yes, that's right, because we have no sort of background default knowledge which to appeal to. It reminds me a little bit of when we did this study, sort of a similar sort of age-appropriate or modified study with adult participants, and we told them the story about a person that died in a car accident. Mm-hmm. And again, just like the mouse, we said that this person was hungry and he was thirsty, and he actually got into a fight with his wife in this case. He put a breath mint into his mouth right before he got into a car accident. He sort of accidentally stepped on the accelerator rather than the brake when he went into a utility pole and died instantaneously. This was the story that we told them. And then we asked the questions about, again, his psychological functioning. Is he still angry at his wife? Does he remember what he studied for the lecture, prepared for the lecture? He was a teacher. Was he still thirsty? And did he still feel sick and so on? Could he still taste the breath mint? We found even atheists, or even extinctivists, which are basically people who believe that psychological functioning stops abruptly at the moment of death. Even they would say things like, well, of course he knows that he's dead. How can you not know that you're dead if you see blackness everywhere around you? So these people aren't necessarily aware that they are contradicting themselves in terms of their explicit beliefs and their intuitive reasoning about the continuity of the mind after death. But we see that in this case, these sort of quasi-structured interviews. So again, this is the type of thing that you couldn't necessarily capture in just sort of a survey. If you just ask people, do you believe in the afterlife? That person would say no, but we sort of trick them essentially in these experimental methodologies and have them reveal their intuitive psychology.
It's a very common belief about why people believe in the afterlife. A view that many philosophers, for example, have held is that it has something to do with us wanting to believe that we're going to not die, that somehow we're terrified of death, or that we want to have some kind of justice in the afterlife. And it's this desire to go on existing, this sort of sense that it would be horrible if we ended up just perishing forever, that makes people believe that there's life after death. So are you just rejecting that completely and saying this kind of sense?
Yeah, I mean, it's not so much me rejecting it necessarily as it is the empirical data. The empirical data speak for themselves in the sense that there's absolutely no correlation between people's fear of death and them actually believing in the afterlife.
Mm-hmm. So this idea that this is in some sense motivated cognition, do you think it just happens not to work in this particular case, the case of the afterlife? Or do you think this approach to thinking about psychology of religion or the cognitive science of religion more generally is just mistaken?
I'm sorry, can you say that one more time?
So, you're rejecting a certain view about the afterlife in particular. But this same sort of approach that people have used to the afterlife, they've used for all sorts of other aspects of the cognitive science of religion. This idea that somehow people's fears or terrors or desires are motivating them to believe in these things. Do you think that just is not going to work across the board, or that it's not going to work just for the case of the afterlife?
Well, I'm not saying that motivation plays absolutely no role whatsoever. But I think that what has been overlooked and very easily overlooked is the fact that there are cognitive biases motivating the way that we think about these types of questions. There's sort of a structure based on our cognitive architecture that we impose on the questions that we ask. So, yes, I do think that these essentially invariant cognitive processes would apply to all sorts of questions, not just reasoning about the afterlife, but reasoning about, say, where things come from, or creationist beliefs.
Mm-hmm. But so, when you've been talking about the afterlife, though, you've been seeing it as sort of a challenge to materialism. The idea that somehow we have that our belief in the afterlife shows we have a belief in something like a soul that would live on after our body. But do you think people really conceive of it in that way? Or do you think they conceive that they will still have a body even after they're dead?
Well, that's actually an interesting question. I mean, I think that if you look at the cognitive scientists working in this area in terms of the intuitive cognition of dualism, for instance, Paul Bloom at Yale, I think you've spoken to before on Blogging Heads, has addressed this question. There's this view that there's the body and the mind, and people differentiate between these two. But in fact, if you think about the afterlife in particular, if you think about death and how we envision the dead, it's almost as though they're conceptualized as these invisible bodies that are somewhere in a physical location. Not so much that there's an essence that can't be perceived, but that there's a body somehow, in as much, a physically incomplete body, but nevertheless a body somehow that we see as surviving biological death.
That if I try to tap into my intuitive sense of what it would be like to be dead and still have an afterlife,
Yes.
I imagine that I would still be able to go for a long walk holding hands with my wife, that I could, say, play music using something like arms and hands. I don't imagine being just a pure, disembodied spiritual essence or something like that.
I think it's impossible even to represent that or to conceptualize that, the sort of bodiless spirit. But I think if you were to simply ask people on the street what they thought the afterlife was like, they would say it's basically the spirit or the essence or the soul of the person without a body. But when we try to imagine that, it's simply impossible to do so without actually embodying the soul.
So let's try now turning to
But
another
I should
aspect.
ask you, though, and let me just interject here, do you actually believe in the afterlife?
No, to tell you the truth, I
This
don't.
is just
But I feel like
your
even though I
intuitive
don't
stance in
believe
relation
in
to how you would think about the afterlife.
See, I feel like a careful cognitive scientist could show that even though I say I don't believe in it, that there's some part of me that kind of does see things in that way. And maybe you could run some tricky experiment on me that would show I'm somehow non-consciously thinking of myself as being able to be alive, be alive even after my body perishes.
Yeah, well, that's a really interesting question. I mean, I said for a long time that just because people are extinctivists or they believe that the consciousness stops the moment of death doesn't mean that privately, unconsciously, they're not reasoning that the mind survives somehow. So this sort of positive nothingness or this sort of blackness that extinctivists believe happens after death is nothing. It's almost as though they're viewing nothingness as a quality or a sort of a state of existence. But yeah, I was actually having a conversation with my sister about this the other day. We were talking about how my father was going through a photo album, and he came across an old girlfriend, and he pointed this out to my sister and said, "I should have stuck with her rather than marrying your mother," which was obviously a little bit offensive to my sister. But the fact that my mother is dead really. My sister shouldn't have been terribly been bothered by that sort of comment because she said that she felt bad for my mother when my father said that. My mother is dead. My sister doesn't believe in the afterlife, so why would she feel bad about my father saying that? It's not as though my mother could actually have her feelings hurt by that comment.
Well, I wonder if your sister would have felt more bad if your father had said that near where your mother is buried, as opposed to really far away, where it would be somehow harder for her to hear.
That's possible. I mean, I personally, I still feel a little bit guilty about not visiting my mother's grave more often, even though, you can find a greater extinctivist or more of an atheist than myself.
Oh, all right. Wait, so let's now turn to a very different aspect of religion.
Okay.
So it seems as though many people think of things that exist within the world as having been created for a particular purpose.
Right.
That is to say, they don't think of the things that exist within the world as just kind of having arisen there, but that in some sense they feel like there's a design behind these things. That even something like the mountains were put there for some kind of purpose. So this seems like a very different aspect of religion from belief in the afterlife, but maybe also one that cognitive scientists of religion can help us to explain.
Right, so this has been another focus of, I guess loosely speaking, the cognitive science of religion, which is people's intuitive biases to reason as though things are here for a reason. And what you find is that even very young children that have not really been exposed to much of science and understand natural selection or evolutionary biology or anything along those lines, sort of have this default toward creationist reasoning. And in particular, reasoning as though things were designed for a purpose. So the question that intuitively arises for these children is who created these things for a purpose? Whose purpose is it? And that's why Deborah Kellerman at Boston University refers to children as being these sort of intuitive theists, that they see things as actually having some sort of design or purpose or existing for a reason. She uses the expression promiscuous teleologists to refer to children, which is that children see not only artifacts, naturally designed artifacts, such as a watch, the famous William Paley example that Richard Dawkins uses quite often, or anything in this room, for instance, this table, the chair, the door. These are all things that have a purpose that were designed by human manufacturers to solve a particular problem. The door, for instance, is designed to divide some sort of ethereal space, one between the other. The chair is for sitting our bodies inside of it. But to understand purpose in this sense, we have to take the perspective of the designer who created these objects. So what Deb Kellman has found essentially is that children who are asked, what is a mountain for, what is a rock for, will automatically say that these things are there to solve a particular purpose or they have a function. So a rock is there and it's pointy so that other animals won't sit on it. Clouds are there for raining, for instance. They have a trouble saying that these types of things just exist because they exist, or they are because they are.
So,
an existential view.
So if you asked me explicitly, why is the mountain there? I wouldn't say something like, so that animals can enjoy climbing on it. I would say something like, well, there are these certain geological phenomena that gave rise to it. But do you think the reason I do that is that there's some little voice within me saying, surely the mountain was there so that animals could climb on it. And then I'm kind of suppressing that little voice and saying, go away, little voice. What I should really answer this question with is some answer in geology.
That's right. It's not as though you through your scientific education, replace these theistic or teleological biases, but rather you're smothering them, you're muzzling them. And we know that because Deborah Kellerman has done some research, for example, with people who are diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, and which basically eats away at their semantic knowledge and their understanding of scientific facts. They'll basically revert back to the sort of 4- and 5-year-old response that these things are here for a particular reason, that the sun is here to give light and to provide light for animals and so on.
So it seems like where all this research is heading is the idea that deep within all of us is a theist, that no matter how much we might want to sort of pound the table and say, I am an atheist, I don't believe in any of this stuff, that there's something within us that's still kind of drawing us toward these theistic kind of views.
Yeah, and I think that's the major problem with I guess most people refer to it as the new atheist movement now. People like Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins and Daniel Dennett, which is that the view that there are essentially these major ideological differences in how people reason about existence. You either believe in God or you don't. When in fact, I think from a psychological perspective, there are a lot of nuances underlying these differences, and even the atheist, I think, is vulnerable or susceptible to reasoning as though there's purpose in life or meaning in life, or that there's an afterlife, for example. I know as an atheist, I oftentimes feel susceptible or vulnerable to reasoning as though, my particular function in life is to show other people that meaning is a cognitive illusion. That's ridiculous, of course, because I know that there's no intrinsic meaning to my life or purpose or function to my life, but because of the types of things that I've done and the things that I feel motivated to do, I feel like that's why I'm here.
So it's almost that you find yourself believing like God put you on this world to prove that there was no God or something like that.
That's right. Obviously I don't believe that explicitly in some sort of rich theological sense. But nevertheless, it's sort of this niggling sense or this feeling that I came from some sort of creator. Now, I think, a lot of atheists, these sort of rabid atheists, would snicker at that and say, this is a closet theist. But in fact, I think that they're just blind to the nuances or the idiosyncrasies, the complexities underlying human cognition and how we reason about these grander existential questions. And that's what these experimental methods are trying to get at.
So, let's not...
I just find this sort of new atheism an interminable bore. I think that it's missing the point fundamentally.
So let's now talk about a sort of more straightforward way in which you might think that God is intervening in the world. Not just, say, by creating the mountains and so forth in the first place, but by doing things that are supposed to be sort of messages to us from God himself. So, is there some way that we can use cognitive science to understand why people believe in this sort of notion? The notion that things that we actually observe in the world are being placed there as a way for God to kind of communicate with us and send us some kind of truth about how we should live, for example.
Yeah, I remember actually, the first time I started thinking about these things deeply was when I was a graduate student, actually, when I was working with chimpanzees. And we were investigating whether chimpanzees had the same type of social cognition as human beings do, or they were fundamentally different to human beings. And we were investigating primarily this question of whether chimpanzees had a theory of mind, which is a theory of mind is basically the ability to reason about the unobservable psychological states that drive or motivate behavior. So I can't see you right now, Josh, but the audience will. I can see myself here on the screen. And if, let's just say that I was interacting with myself, I would see a body, I would see a form, I would see myself moving about in various ways. But I couldn't see physically my mind that lies behind my skull. It's in there somewhere. I make inferences and attributions based on the behaviors that I'm generating about what's causing those behaviors. But I can't physically or literally see my mind in a meaningful way. And that's what a theory of mind basically is. It's a theory of the psychological states generating behavior, unobservable psychological states. And although it's a controversial area, most researchers, I think at this point, would lean on the side of reasoning that human beings are fundamentally unique, at least in the strength of their theory of mind or their capacity to reason about psychological states. And this got me interested originally in this question about God, for example, which is that to reason about God, we can't see God. We can only sort of envision or represent an absent mind. So why do things happen to us? Why, for example, do I happen to be here in Belfast, out of all places? If I look retrospectively at all the sort of sequence of autobiographical events that led to me being right here, right now, I might see some sort of significance or purpose or meaning behind what led me here right now. I love my job, by the way. But I can't see God. I'm just simply making attributions of his motives and his emotions and his desires for what I should be doing. I think I mentioned to you not too long ago, you were actually here in Belfast, Josh, that one example would be if you go into a bookstore and there's a book that you simply, you for whatever reason you happen to gravitate toward, and it seems to answer a fundamental problem that you've been asking yourself, or it's really interesting, and it's almost as though you were meant to read it. That's a really subtle type of theory of mind, because you're attributing some sort of reason or purpose or desire of some agency and sort of gravitating you toward that book, whether it's God or some other nondescript agency. But nevertheless, it happened for a reason. But there's something there that's communicating a message for you. It wanted you to read that book. I think that's something that happens to atheists and non-believers alike on an everyday basis. We see meaning, messages, communicative intent embedded in unexpected or natural events. So natural events oftentimes take the form of behaviors that we make attributions about the mind behind those behaviors. That seems a bit abstract, I know, and probably a little bit complicated. But one way to get at this is through laboratory techniques. And do we have time for me to go over one basic study?
Yeah. So maybe you could talk about, say, the Princess Alice study.
Right. So the question would be, what sort of mind does it take to see meaning in natural events, or to see messages, hidden intent in the occurrence of natural events? I think a lot of people would call those omens, but that seems a little bit too unnecessarily supernatural to me. I think a lot of people have these sort of everyday mundane experiences without really calling them supernatural or omens or anything along those lines. So let me give you an example of a study that we did a couple of years ago at the University of Arkansas before I moved here to Belfast, where we put children in a room, basically, and we made things happen. We made unexpected events happen, and we wanted to see whether children would intuitively or automatically reason about these things as carrying some sort of message or symbolic communication as being embedded in the event. This particular study involved children between the ages of 4 and 9 years of age. And they were divided up into 3 age groups. There were the 4-year-olds, essentially the 6-year-olds, and the 8 and the 9-year-olds. We wanted to find out if children reasoned about the occurrence of these unexpected events in different ways. So in this study, I'm going to show you a couple of images here on the screen. We brought children into the laboratory. We showed them 2 boxes, box A and box B. And we also showed them a ball, which you can see in the experimenter's hand right now. And we said that the experimenter is going to hide this ball inside one of these 2 boxes. The child's responsibility was to choose which of the 2 boxes the ball was hidden inside. And they did that by placing their hand on top of one of these boxes. But the rule was that they had 15 seconds, basically, to make their choice. They could put their hand on top of one of these boxes. They could move their hand to the other box if they changed their mind. But wherever their hand was when the experimenter said time's up was their final choice. And they got a reward as soon as this, if they picked the right box, but if they chose the wrong box, they got nothing. There were 2 conditions in this study. One condition, which was just what I described, the children heard these rules. The other condition, these children were told that there's an invisible princess in the room with them. Here you can see the experimenter pointing to a picture of this princess. The children were told, this is a picture of Princess Alice. She can make herself invisible. And she's going to help you play this game. She's going to tell you somehow when you choose the wrong box. I don't know how she's going to tell you, the experimenter said, but somehow she'll tell you if you chose the wrong box. And in both conditions, the child saw on 2 trials, there were 4 trials in all, something unexpected occurring. So there was this picture of Princess Alice on the door fell to the ground suddenly as soon as the child's hand touched the box, or the light flashed on and off as soon as the child's hand touched the box. And the question was whether the child moved their hand to the opposite box as though they understood this was a message or a sign from Princess Alice. So the child went to the corner while the ball was being hidden, then came back to the boxes and put their hand on top of one of the boxes, whichever they thought the ball was inside. In fact, there were 2 balls. I should have said that. This was sort of rigged in advance. Then as soon as the child's hand touched the box, something happened. Either the picture fell or a light flashed on and off, and the question was whether the children moved their hand to the opposite box. And in this particular study, only the oldest children, the 9-year-olds, moved their hand to the opposite box, which suggests that there was some sort of cognitive developmental mechanism underlying children's ability to reason as though there's meaning or purpose or some sort of communicative intent embedded in a natural event.
But now it seems very puzzling that we would end up ascribing meaning and purpose to natural events in this way. I mean, you might think that we would evolve to become creatures who didn't ascribe this kind of meaning, who didn't believe in the afterlife, and who didn't think that objects in the natural world had purpose. You might think those of us who didn't make these kinds of descriptions would do better, and that eventually we'd become a kind of species that would be a non-religious species. So it seems really puzzling that all of these phenomena you're describing actually do exist in us.
Right, so that's, that actually taps into the much broader question, which is whether religion is an adaptation or whether it's simply some sort of byproduct of other evolved mechanisms. And this is a really controversial question, of course. There are people coming down on both sides of the fence. I think it's actually a very complicated question. It's probably not as clear-cut as it sounds. Is religion an adaptation or a byproduct? But if I were forced to choose, I would probably be more of an adaptationist and say that religion actually did confer adaptive significance or have some sort of adaptive benefits. And, one of the reasons is that if, for example, we were concerned that other people were, if, for example, we thought that we could get away with something, Josh, you and I are, right now, we're having a conversation, so if I said something really offensive to you, it's not going to stay just between the two of us, is it? It's going to, everybody who's watching this at the moment, people who talk about it, you might tell people outside of this conversation about whatever it was that I did inappropriate. I have to be very concerned about this sort of immediate social encounter. And that's something that's fun. That's a novel adaptive problem for human beings, and it has something to do with the evolution of language. Because the fact that you could tell other people, you could communicate this to outside sources, this information could sort of grasshopper between minds, means that I have to be very careful and very wary of how I'm coming across in any given social dynamic. So I have to constantly inhibit my social behaviors, being wary of the fact that you can communicate this to outside sources. So, if I completely botched this interview or this conversation, or I said something really offensive or obnoxious or whatever, all those types of things can come back to haunt me in the sense of ruining or miring my reputation. So I'm constantly on guard of that.
So it seems like
one way that religion is adaptive is that we feel as though we're being watched and we feel as though we're being observed by some sort of supernatural agents, whether those are the eyes of the dead, for instance, or God. If I feel that God wants me to do something, or supernatural agents of the dead want me to do something in particular, I'm probably going to orient my behavior accordingly. And that's going to help me to inhibit things that would have been otherwise sort of emotionally motivated or much more intuitive to me.
So it seems like one way to test this hypothesis would be to see whether people who are more religious actually do less often do things that break societal norms and land them with a really bad reputation.
Yes, I think that's true, and I think that you could actually you could generate that through some sort of experimental methods if you were to prime religious people, for example, with thoughts of supernatural agents watching them or observing them or judging them. One would certainly expect them to be more pro-social and less anti-social under those conditions.
Right, and in fact, there are all these studies showing that effect does arise. But I wonder if this was the aim of Mother Nature, if this was sort of the adaptationist function of religion, wouldn't there be an easier way of obtaining this aim? Instead of giving us a whole cognitive science of religion, evolution could have just given us a greater ability to inhibit prepotent impulses, or it could have given us a stronger conscience, or in other ways it could have done something much, much simpler.
That's certainly true, and I do think that we've evolved independently inhibitive capacities, this sort of greater executive control, which is demonstrated by various aspects of neurological architecture. But that's not to say that this additional sort of safeguard wouldn't be adaptive in its own right.
Oh, so it's that this serves as just a little extra help for us in allowing us to sort of...
Even if it's negligible, if it would have been even remotely ancestrally adaptive, it would have been selected for.
It seems like there would be another possible way of explaining it, which would be really the opposite of the one that you just gave, which was we developed this capacity to understand other minds, so what's often called theory of mind. And then once we had this capacity, it enabled us to see other things as having minds. And then it was important in having that capacity to avoid certain kinds of errors. But there's a difference between two different kinds of errors. If I mistakenly think that something, that the rustling in the tree is someone coming to attack me, but it isn't, it's just the wind, it's not so bad. But if I mistakenly think that the rustling in the tree is just the wind, but it's really someone coming to attack me, it's very bad. So you might think evolution just made us err on the side of caution in attributing minds to just about everything, in trying to avoid at all costs the error of mistakenly thinking that there isn't a mind.
I think that certainly, you're talking about the hyperactive agency detection device put forward by both Stuart Guthrie and Justin Barrett. But that's never been terribly convincing to me, because if you think about the types of attributions, religious attributions that people make in terms of when they're inferring meaning or some sort of communicative message in natural events, it's not so much a perceptually obvious cue like rustling branches or moving bushes or something along those lines. It's more these abstract autobiographical categories like being diagnosed with cancer, your parents getting divorced, breaking up with a boyfriend or a girlfriend, those things are the ones that actually seem to be carrying or embodying some sort of communicative intent.
Mm-hmm.
And there's no obvious perceptual features that go along with triggering this hyperactive agency detection device. I think that's where it fails to resonate in the sense of being a byproduct. If we see life experiences basically as happening for a particular reason, we feel as though there is a God or a supernatural agent who wants us to behave in a particular fashion, and we subscribe to those quite readily.
But now, suppose we consider all the different aspects of religion. So far, you've just been talking about this last thing that we discussed, the idea that we can feel as though God is somehow watching us. But suppose we consider, for example, the afterlife. Is there any explanation of how that could have an adaptive significance? Or there, would you accept the kind of approach that I was suggesting, where it's just a byproduct of things that arose for other reasons?
So you're asking whether the afterlife was more of a sort of an adaptation or a byproduct?
Yes, so is there an adaptationist explanation of our belief in the afterlife?
I think there could have been. I mean, I think that it obviously, within certain ecological contexts, it could have been adaptive if one envisioned the afterlife as actually conferring some sort of benefits or actually administering a punishment to people who misbehaved. I think that it would have been much more adaptive if people were to have feared the afterlife, if they thought they would be punished for things that they did in this life, because that would have been much more important in the sense of deterring the individual from engaging in transgressions that they would have been punished for and which would have compromised their reproductive success.
But suppose someone said to you, that is possible, the thing that you just said, as is the possibility that the reason we believe in God is because it helps us to obey certain norms by thinking that there's someone out there watching us. But suppose they then said that there's just no way to test those hypotheses. If we observe, for example, that right now, when people believe in supernatural beings, they more obey certain norms, that in itself wouldn't show that the reason we believe in the afterlife is because it serves that adaptive function.
Well, I think that the reason that we believe in the afterlife is because, if we go back to an earlier point in our conversation, people simply can't envision the absence of consciousness very clearly. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that incapacity itself would not have conferred some sort of adaptive benefit.
Oh, wait, I wasn't suggesting that there's a reason not to believe that it has this adaptive function. I meant, consider the belief in God and the belief that God is watching us. So, you suggested, and you provided really beautiful evidence for the view that the reason that this kind of belief causes people to obey certain norms, like moral norms. But now, suppose someone said, there's just no way to know whether that is truly the adaptive function. It's at this point, we do actually more obey moral norms when we think God is watching us. But if we're wondering whether our belief in God evolves because it serves that purpose, one person might think one thing and the other person might think another thing, but someone might say, there's no way to test any of these beliefs. These are theories about what happened in our evolutionary past.
Well, the theoretical inference is, and to the extent that, these ancestral conditions, where people would have lived in much smaller social communities where there was no privacy and there was always the risk of being observed by other individuals within the in-group, and you could have always underestimated the risk of social detection. It would have been much more adaptive to have inhibited some sort of transgressions or antisocial behaviors than to have gotten away with it. So I think what we're seeing right now is a sort of an after effect of those ancestral conditions. Obviously, it's a completely different ecological environment. These contemporary city systems where there are millions of people, where anonymity really is in fact a possibility, and privacy is much more of a reality. In the ancestral past, those types of factors would not have been present, and we're still operating under the assumptions that, or at least our unconscious brains are operating on the assumptions that we should be very careful about what we do because we could be always underestimating the risk of social detection by actual people. Independent of the fact that God does or doesn't exist, if we believe in God or we're inclined to think that God exists and he's watching us, we'd be less likely to engage in behaviors that would have compromised our reproductive success.
So, Jesse Bering, it's been great talking with you, and I'm really looking forward to seeing the later experiments or later theoretical work that you end up doing on these difficult questions.
Thanks. I think we've got a bunch of experiments that are designed to test these types of hypotheses and many others. But it's been great speaking with you.